I think we'll begin. First of all, welcome everyone. Good evening to you all. My name's Toby Simpson and I'm the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, and it's my absolute pleasure to be hosting and chairing the panel this evening for the virtual book launch of the Palgrave Handbook of Britain and the Holocaust, which I have here, edited by Tom Lawson and Andy Pearce, who we'll be hearing from shortly. And I couldn't be more pleased that Andy and Tom approached the library to host the launch of this important book. The library is, of course, the oldest and largest archive of material relating to the Holocaust in Britain, and so has been the source and the fount of many studies relating to the Holocaust, and also a lot of scholarship relating to Britain's relationship to the Holocaust. So this seems like an excellent place to discuss and to celebrate the completion of this very timely volume of essays. And I think it's also an important moment in the history of Holocaust memory in Britain, as the debate around the construction of a new Holocaust memorial in Westminster is underway. And before we start, I will shortly be handing over to Tom and Andy to introduce the volume, but I just thought I would say a few words about the Wiener Holocaust Library, as there could be some people in the audience who haven't heard of the library or haven't been to the library. In fact, it hasn't been possible to come along to the library in person for quite a while, although recently we have reopened our doors and there is socially distanced places in the reading room that are open for booking for appointments. And in fact, on the 17th of May, we will be reopening our exhibition, something we're very excited about, and our current exhibition, Death Marches, Evidence and Memory, is actually co-curated by two people who I know are in the audience this evening, Professor Dan Stone and Dr. Christine Schmidt. And Dan Stone, of course, is one of the contributors to this volume, an essay on Belsen in British memory. So I would absolutely recommend to everyone to if you aren't able to get a hold of the book yourself, to come and consult it at the library. And I would just conclude by saying that, yes, we will be open. Again, please visit our website, wienerholocaustlibrary.org, if you'd like to book a place to come to visit the reading room. We're based at 29 Russell Square in London, and we very much look forward to seeing you soon. So with that, I will move on to introducing the editors of the Palgrave Handbook of Britain and the Holocaust. Tom Lawson, Professor of History at Northumbria University, who is the author of and editor of several books, and the co-editor of Holocaust Studies, a Journal of Culture and History. And Andy Pearce, Associate Professor of the Holocaust and History Education at the University College London, who has also written and edited several books on Holocaust history, and of course is the co-editor of this book. So I will first hand over, I think, to Andy.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, Toby, and thank you for the warm words of introduction. It's our pleasure to be hosted by yourself in the library this evening. Indeed, as you say, the library is a very fitting setting for this particular launch, and we're extremely grateful to you for agreeing to host us tonight. Can I also thank the panelists who agreed to participate this evening. We're very appreciative of your time, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your reflections on how Britain has and hasn't engaged with the Holocaust over the last 70 or 80 years. And finally, by way of thanks to the contributors to the volume itself, a number of who are in the audience this evening. We quite literally wouldn't have a handbook without your contributions, and we're extremely grateful to you for your involvement in the project. I'm just going to say a few words of orientation, and I think the first thing I wanted to emphasize is that the handbook is very much a study in and an exploration of history and memory. And I think this premise is central to the book. In putting the book together, we were interested not just in constructing a chronicle of Britain's relationship with the Holocaust, we also wanted to examine how the historical foundations of that relationship have been constituted in memory work. Indeed, we were particularly concerned with how the history of Britain and the Holocaust has been reaggregated through acts that Barbara Meyerhoff would describe as remembering. That is, those special types of recollection which are configured in particular towards constructing individual or collective identities, primarily through narrative and through story. And for us, I think it's only possible to understand the various aspects and dimensions of the story, or indeed the stories of Britain and the Holocaust, by looking through the lenses of both history and memory. And in the process to contemplate how these two things interface and interplay. And now, because of these interests, the handbook is unavoidably also a commentary on our own contemporary culture and society. The original stimulus for the book was the launching of David Cameron's Holocaust Commission back in 2014, and our particular concern at how that project broached and understood both the historical record and the workings of history and memory in Britain. But as the project's evolved, as it's developed, as the chapters of the various contributors have come in, and as the world has continued to turn, we've become increasingly attuned to just how inseparable this book is from our present day context. One of those contexts is Holocaust specific. It's the milieu where anti-Semitic attacks continue in this country, where much historical ignorance persists, where young people are prone to aping myths and misconceptions about the genocide and the perpetrators and the victims, and where we observe abhorrent misappropriations of, for example, the Star of David by anti-lockdown protesters most recently in the news. But another context is the broader social, cultural and political landscape of the early 21st century Western society. That terrain where, as we know, sadly, populism currently predominates. Fake news and so-called alternative facts are common refrains and claims, and where intellectual rigor and expertise are often viewed by some with outright hostility. Now, we believe that history and memory matter in these particular settings. And in terms of Holocaust history and memory in Britain, there seems to be only added weight to those now often cited remarks made by the late David Cesarani 5 years ago, when he bemoaned the yawning gulf between popular understandings of the history and the current scholarship on the subject. Now, plugging this gap is not straightforward. We believe, of course, that the handbook can make a contribution to that process, but evidently it can't do it on its own. We would like to suggest that what is needed perhaps is a wider recognition of that gulf in society itself, a willingness and a resolve on the part of people in power, in influence, to ensure that collective works of memory are informed by history, and maybe a determination among everyone who is interested in the Holocaust as public history to enter into informed discussion, dialogue, and debate. Now, that's a very lofty ambition and hope, I realise, but maybe this evening can serve as a start of a conversation which hopefully can extend and bring in more and more people as we move forward. So thank you again, Toby, for your generous hospitality. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, contributors. Tom, I'll give the floor to you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks. Obviously, I echo Andy's thanks. I'll start with an apology, which is that I'm sorry that I haven't been able to contribute to the very impressive sort of bookshelf off that we have going on the videos here. So yeah, I can only apologise for that. I'll talk very briefly and then invite others to contribute. I think, broadly speaking, the handbook. I echo what Andy said. The handbook was trying to do two things. I think it was an effort to take a kind of snapshot of the field as it is, and it was an effort to try and move the field on, or at least point some new directions. And I hope it does that. I think that it has some problems. I think it points to a kind of unequally developed and developing field. I think it's notable, for example, that there's been no really comprehensive new history of Britain's relationship with the Holocaust. I use that word history advisedly for some time. There's certainly been no new political history, which I think is interesting, and you'll read relatively little in the volume about how British state and society responded to the murder of Europe's Jews as it was being enacted. And I think that that's a problem, and I hope that that gap will be filled soon. We do in the volume suggest some ways in which that gap could be filled, not least, I think, by considering British responses within the context of reactions to other forms of mass violence, and which I think would be an interesting development. What, for example, does our potentially clearer view now of the British Commission of Mass Violence do to our understanding of Britain's reaction to the genocide of the Jews? And scholarship in that area is often predicated on the assumption that the genocide was somehow unique or apart. So how might we understand better responses if we jettison that notion and see reactions to the Holocaust in a much wider context of violence against civilians, both within and without the British world? I think the book is also concerned very much with stories that Britain tells itself about the Holocaust. And in that sense, I think it is timely. We're about a year on now from the George Floyd protests and the reflections that they brought into view, I guess, about how racial violence in the British past operated. And I'm particularly interested in how the Holocaust does or doesn't fit into that debate or discourse. The image on the front cover of the book of Victoria Gardens was very deliberately chosen. The idea that we may soon have a Holocaust memorial on a site where a memorial to the victims of slavery, for example, was denied, where a memorial to abolition now stands, is an irony that that shouldn't really be lost on anyone. To put it crudely, we'll have a memorial to the victims of, broadly speaking, German imperialism outside Parliament, but not to the victims of British imperialism. And that, it seems to me, is surely noteworthy and is a very clear articulation about the fears that I certainly have about the direction that Holocaust memory memorialization is moving in this country. So memory ought to be multi-directional. Acknowledgement of the horrors of the Holocaust should occasion asking awkward questions about the present and about other pasts, but I'm not sure that it does so. And I think that that's one of the lessons of the volume, that perhaps it doesn't do that, that it almost has the opposite effect. Delightfully, it seems to me, symbolized by a memorial built precisely on a site where a memorial to other victims of mass violence was denied. And so, as Andy says, one's left drawn back really to David Cesarani's observation about the yawning gulf between a public and historical understanding of the Holocaust, or in this case, Britain and the Holocaust. And the risk, it seems to me, rising all of the time is that the Holocaust somehow is a good news story for Britain. And the central aim of the book was really to be an antidote to that view. And I think that it's ultimately for others to judge how successful it is in that. But I'll end there and hand back to Toby, but thank you.
Thank you, Tom and Andy. And I just wanted to let everybody know that we are hoping to encourage discussion and questions through the contributions of our panel, who I'll shortly be introducing. So I would really like to invite people throughout the contributions of the various panelists to type in questions into the chat. I think Andy and Tom have already opened up quite a field for discussion there, and we'd really like to see that happen as after the panel, for us to be able to engage in some of the questions that I'm sure these comments have already raised in the minds of the guests this evening. So to introduce our first panelists, we will be hearing first from contributors to the volume, and then we will be hearing from Donald Bloxham and Michael Rosen, both of whom will be reflecting on their thoughts on the book. So to begin, we will be hearing from Hannah Holtschneider, whose contribution to the book was Holocaust Representation in the Imperial War Museum 2000 to 2020. And Hannah is a senior lecturer in Jewish studies at the University of Edinburgh. She's a cultural historian of 20th century history with a particular focus on the Holocaust, Jewish identities, and non-Jewish Jewish relations. Hannah.
Well, hello and good evening from Edinburgh. Thank you for including my work in the volume and for inviting me to speak on this panel. Following our brief for these introductory reflections that was supposed to talk about the past, the present and the future of Britain's engagement with the Holocaust, I've decided to apportion my time by giving most attention to the present and little to the past and the future, perhaps in keeping with the weighting of the contributions to the volume. So the question of Britain's engagement with the Holocaust in the past is addressed early in the handbook. The first 3 parts spotlight a few historical events through considering domestic politics, refugee policy, and the reception of refugees, as well as knowledge about the genocide of Jews and the liberation of Bergen-Belsen by the British Army. And they're also considering the evolving historiography over the past 7 decades. These early parts of the volume lay the ground for the consideration of a range of post-war periods. In parts 4 to 8 of the handbook, other academic fields enter the discussion. Here we then see explicit negotiations between the findings of historians and the projects of social, cultural, and political actors who engage the history of the Holocaust for a specific purpose in the present. With increasing distance from the historical events themselves, the Holocaust is often not discussed in its historical specificity. Rather, it is co-opted into a range of political contexts and appropriated to serve an array of pedagogical aims. One prominent example, which is discussed in the handbook by Andy Pearce and David Tollerton, is the National Holocaust Memorial that will be built in Victoria Gardens. This in many ways exemplifies the desire to derive positive national self-affirmation from the Holocaust. Other contexts of appropriation that feature in the handbook concern education, which is surveyed by Stuart Foster, Holocaust Memorial Day, which is explored by my fellow panelist here, Cara Critchell, and my own contribution on the first permanent Holocaust exhibition in the Imperial War Museum. In the present then, I am struck by 3 widening gaps between trends in historiography and developments in education, both at secondary level and in state-funded public pedagogy. Firstly, I see a gap between ever more complex Holocaust historiography and the co-opting of the Holocaust to bolster simplistic oppositions between good and evil, positioning Britain as a good bastion of democracy against the evil perpetrators of genocide on the continent. Through the opening of archives in post-1990 Eastern Europe, changing professional agendas, new generations of scholars, to name but a few crucial factors, Holocaust historiography today enables an ever more detailed picture of events as they unfolded, unsettling assumptions about what motivates humans to act in particular ways. This is, as yet, not well reflected in educational initiatives that seek lessons for our own contexts today, contexts that are very different from those of the past. Secondly, I see a gap between the complex historiography of empire as it is researched in our universities, including its continued repercussions in Britain today, and the teaching of British history that largely eclipses genocides perpetrated by Britain in favour of focusing on the Holocaust. While the Holocaust is taught as part of British history, attention is given to the positive role of Britain as a destination for refugees and of British soldiers in the liberation of camps like Bergen-Belsen. This comes at the expense of understanding events in which British leaders and officials were perpetrators and has repercussions for other areas of the curriculum, namely point 3. I see a gap between the aspirations of citizenship education that engages particular versions of the Holocaust and a self-reflective exploration of British history. Rather than place the Holocaust centre stage in the education of British citizens and discourses about British identity, it seems to me that it would be more helpful to examine the long trajectory of British involvement in colonialism and the brutalisation of subjects. About the future of British engagements with the Holocaust, I can only speculate. Therefore, I close with an observation and a wish. We live in volatile times. Social tensions proliferate in the wake of Brexit, and the results of next week's ballots may well foreshadow a breakup of the Union. Climate change, the continuing injustices highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too campaign are concerns that rightly continue to unsettle our society. And yet, there is much opportunity here too, as young people spearhead calls for change and justice. So optimistically, I wish that our wonderful students join us as they move from school to university or other further education opportunities and use their considerable critical thinking skills and challenge the simplistic co-opting of truncated versions of the Holocaust for political ends, and that they grapple with a past that is no less complex than our present. Here is a chance to observe how others acted in the political storms of not so long ago, and what human qualities we may harness to make sense of our complex societies and work for justice in our own present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. We're now going to hear from another contributor to the book. We'll be hearing from Cara Critchell, whose contribution was entitled From Celebrating Diversity to British Values, the Changing Face of Holocaust Memorial Day in Britain. Cara Critchell is lecturer in history at the University of Chester. Her research expertise is in British cultural engagement with genocide, perpetrators of mass violence, and political violence in contemporary society. Cara.
Thank you, Toby. And just to echo Hannah, thank you, Tom and Andy, for the invitation to talk today. So when I was asked to talk, I was thinking about sort of what would I say about thinking about the past, present of how we've engaged with the Holocaust. And I actually took quite a personal journey down memory lane to 20 years ago when I was 15, and it was the first Holocaust Memorial Day. And to me at the time, that felt like such an important thing. It felt, I was really pleased. I was part of the generation that got shown the edited version of Schindler's List in the classroom. It was very emotive. And now we had a day to remember the Holocaust. And I felt at that point, age 15, this is excellent. And I still do believe in the importance of Holocaust remembrance. But fast forward a few years to 2006, and I was a third-year undergraduate taking a special subject on the Holocaust. And I started to read some of the debates that were going on about Britain and the Holocaust, most particularly about Holocaust memory, sort of brought about by the establishment of this very same Holocaust Memorial Day by people like Dan Stone, Tony Kushner, Donald and David Cesarani, about the place of the Holocaust in British life. And it gave me such a different insight into how the Holocaust was being considered inside academia, but it also made me reflect on the difference between that and the Holocaust that I'd encountered as a 15-year-old in sort of wider society. And one of the big things that I think struck me and that has sort of stayed with me and I've thought about sort of over the sort of following 20 years, worryingly, is about the way in which the state, political parties, different organisations have sought to engage with and utilise the Holocaust, what they've chosen to remember, what they've chosen to forget. All of these things raise, to me, very big questions and concerns, particularly moving forward, sort of thinking about what we're going to remember about the Holocaust in the future. Because what I hadn't realised when I was 15 years old was that the commemoration of the Holocaust was inherently political back in 2001. Britain's restrictive policies towards immigration were downplayed and increasingly sidelined. Politicians were increasingly signing books of remembrance to express their commitment to Holocaust remembrance, and it was obviously sort of quite, it could be very sincere, it could also be very performative. In essence, what was happening in sort of those early years of Holocaust sort of memory in Britain after Holocaust Memorial Day, for me was the celebration of liberal democracy, a very active celebration about civic responsibility, ideas about citizenship, and the transformative power of the Holocaust was emphasised, and indeed I think this is still emphasised today. More recently, perhaps, possibly with the transition of government from Labour to Conservative, but I think the signs are already there, we're seeing a deliberate move away from just celebrating liberal democracy towards aligning the Holocaust with so-called British values, as Hannah sort of alluded to. And this is becoming a central part of British education, even though I'm not entirely sure most people have any clue what is particularly British about these British values or what they're actually meant to be. But they are here, and this is how the Holocaust is being talked about in our schools. We see the celebration of British heroes of the Holocaust. We see, as we've seen before, like the Holocaust Commission being established. Schools are increasingly using the Holocaust as a vehicle through which to talk about these perceived British values. There's something about either pro-British identity or about the way in which these two things can work together. Now, this hasn't gone unnoticed that we are in this realm of the Holocaust being utilised to promote a particular British identity. There are challenges to this. I know David Tollerton has written about the tensions surrounding the position of the new memorial alongside Parliament. And so I was thinking about all of these things and thinking about sort of the involvement of the state, the politicization of the Holocaust, and it made me reflect on, okay, actually looking back from now to when I was 15 years old, has actually the way in which Britain engages with the Holocaust, has that actually changed over that time? On the one hand, clearly, yes, what I've said, about the move from, say, the universalized sort of liberal democracy to British values, that has changed. But on the other hand, the questions raised in those articles that I was reading as an undergraduate, Dan Stone, Donald Bloxham, Tony Kushner, I think a lot of those still remain unanswered. And that's sort of, for me, moving forward, something that we still need to consider. Questions about the role of the state in Holocaust remembrance, questions about the day and the recognition of other genocides. Now that I teach a special subject on genocide, it's always a shock to me that my students, very bright, educated students, they know about Holocaust Memorial Day, but they don't know that that day incorporates other genocides, that at local level, when they have been taught this at school, it doesn't feature. And so on the one hand, I feel like much has changed in terms of Holocaust memory and British engagement with it. On the other hand, we're still perhaps where we were back in 2001 with these debates, still unanswered. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cara. And so for our third panelist, we have Donald Bloxham, who is a professor of history at the University of Edinburgh and has written extensively on genocide and the Holocaust. And in recent publications, he's also turned to questions about the writing of history and the relationship between morality and history. So I think it's especially appropriate that he would speak about his reflections on this volume, and we're very much looking forward to hear what you have to say, Donald.
Oh, well, thank you, Toby, and thank you all for having me, for the introduction. It's an honour to be here. I think that we're in danger of all agreeing so far, and I think I probably agree with pretty much everything that's been said so far. Thinking about where we are now, where we're going, it's a peculiarity. When I was an undergraduate, so I was taught in my final year as an undergraduate, it was 1994. Same year as the Rwandan genocide. I was actually taught in one of the first kind of in-depth courses on the Holocaust in the country, studying the Holocaust at the same time as the Rwandan genocide, and as towards the latter stages of the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. And we were encouraged by our then teacher to make some connections. And it was that was also the year, I think, was it, that Schindler's List came out. Anyway, it was around there we had a real significant kind of watershed moments in terms of expanded British engagement and with the Holocaust. And it's really noticeable in that course of those what is that 25 years more since then, that how important partly the Holocaust, partly Nazism is to our self definition in the UK. And I think the Holocaust came late, but into our collective consciousness, but fitted quite easily in there because there was always this Nazi/German other, which we could identify, and the Holocaust kind of fit against which we could identify, and the Holocaust fitted into that. So one of the dangers, I think, that we're all alluding to is a kind of rendering of the Holocaust safe somehow, in the sense that, quite rightly, we wish to other the event itself because it's appalling. But what we sort of do in a positive sense against that is less clear. But I think this is partly due to a lack of clarity, or an ongoing lack of clarity, and perhaps it's even impossible to answer, about what the point of Holocaust education is, what the point of it is. I mean, I know that there's an awful lot of people involved in Holocaust education, and that there are certain didactic goals established and certain standards that people are supposed to reach in order to be said to be educated about the Holocaust. But there seems to be something of a gulf of the why. And it's at the nexus of two separate but related kind of axes, if I can speak in those. One is the kind of, let's say, the specificity of the Holocaust, the uniqueness, as some people would call it, on one hand, as against the more general issues it raises about other genocides and crimes against humanity, for instance. And the other axis is the one, or other dichotomy, I should perhaps say, is the distinction between the intrinsic significance of the Holocaust and what we might call its instrumental significance. I don't think there's anyone who studies the Holocaust that doesn't believe it has massive intrinsic significance. And some significant degree, that sense of its intrinsic significance has justly driven a lot of the educational projects and educational awareness. But there's also often been this big hook that knowing about the Holocaust, as well as teaching you about something intrinsically significant, will also have the following instrumental effects in terms of teaching you something more general, whatever that might be, whether it be about citizenship, whether it be about, you know, British values, whether it be about, you know, racism, tolerance. And it's at that kind of instrumental level that I feel that we might end up in the kind of banalizing area. You know, I mean, it seems to me that some iterations of Holocaust education simply end up treating the Holocaust as a gigantic hate crime, you know, and that the main lesson of the Holocaust is that we shouldn't be racist and we should be tolerant, which seems to me is obviously a desirable lesson, but it seems to me to evacuate most of the specificity of the Holocaust, because the same lessons could be learned just as well from, say, a study of the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the, you know, and the subsequent police action subsequent to that. So there still seems to be the sort of, you know, the difficulty between what we might call the intrinsic and instrumental significances on one hand, and unique or particular versus kind of universal. There still seems to be a lot of tensions in those areas, and I'm not sure. Maybe those are fruitful tensions. I don't know. But when I think about, and there are certainly seem to be some what I would consider interesting and positive developments. I've read a little bit, and I see that Dan Stone and Suzanne Bargett are in the audience here about kind of some of the new developments in terms of the Imperial War Museum's Holocaust plans and looking at the perpetrators in a way that can be sometimes considered to be quite controversial, but I think to be quite productive in terms, if done correctly, in terms of stimulating people to think about not just the Holocaust as horrific experience, quite rightly horrific experience for victims, but also getting people into that area of thinking about what it is to be a perpetrator. You know, that's morally difficult terrain, but also very important terrain, because you know, in some sense, thinking about human potentialities, then thinking about perpetratorhood as well as bystanderhood are really, really very important things. But overall, yeah, I do think there has been perhaps one expects. It's also a difficulty, I think, when one is a kind of an intellectual engaged with this on a professional basis, because one tends to engage with it at a much deeper level and want things that can't plausibly be transmitted at a level of kind of public policy and memorial and general education. So in that sense, kind of academics are tricky people to ask about this, because they're always going to find something to pick at and criticize about kind of general public memorial projects. But I do feel there's been a kind of a rendering of the Holocaust as somehow safe, which seems the opposite of what it should be. You know, I mean, this is an event that should prompt the most far-reaching questions, and yet we've had a kind of a timid memorial culture, in the sense that it can be, you know, anything that can be embraced by the range of different governments we've had over the last 20 years or whatever, and they can all sort of neatly buy into this without any of them actually seem to raise any problems for anything that they do or any policies that they introduce. For instance, policies against, you know, Gypsy, Roma, and traveller communities. You know, and you know, that doesn't seem to be part of, you know, part of discriminatory policies, I would argue. That doesn't seem to be part of the general conversation, yet clearly they were targeting, you know, Romanies and travellers were targets of the Nazis at a genocidal level. And a kind of memorial culture around the Holocaust that doesn't seem to lead to sort of criticism of state policy, perhaps because it's precisely the state that's kind of mandating, or not necessarily the state, but successive governments of the state that are mandating particular memorial regimes, seems to be a bit tricky. And also we've had the fact this week that you know, Joe Biden recognized the Armenian genocide, which is something that successive British governments have been too well, it's not cowardly, it's just self-interested refusal to recognize that. And the whole kind of idea of basing a Holocaust Memorial Day upon, you know, the Holocaust and genocide subsequent to that, well, a big element of that was clearly so they didn't have to tackle the difficult question of Armenian genocide recognition, given Turkish official opposition to Armenian genocide recognition. And when you've got your kind of day kind of compromised at that basic moral level, it doesn't, again, it feeds into this concept of the Holocaust being made safe for contemporary British consumption, and made safe for the kind of the project of contemporary political parties, rather than casting a critical light upon power. By the way, that's everything I have to say. I just want to say now that I think it's time that we went on a bear hunt.
Thank you, Donald. So the handbook does include a number of chapters which examine the history and experiences of Jewish refugees to Britain and survivors of the Holocaust who came to Britain. And I think it's also been a notable development in recent years how many individual writers, journalists, authors, historians have begun to excavate experiences within family histories. Some notable examples might include East West Street, Hadley Freeman's House of Broken Glass, and Ariana Neumann's When Time Stopped. And Michael Rosen has also been on a similar journey with this wonderful book, The Missing, which was partly researched at the library. And I think it's now a very good moment to hear from Michael about the meaning of the relationship between Britain and the Holocaust from your perspective, Michael.
Thanks very much, Toby. Thanks, everybody, and welcome and hello to everybody who's here. Yes, one aspect that we haven't considered so far, which as I read the book, I found myself reflecting on, is the way in which part of the way in which the relationship between the Holocaust and Britain is held is within British Jewish families. So it's held within you and within your family, various kinds of memories, stories largely that took place in other parts, didn't happen in Britain, with the one exception of however we should describe the Channel Islands, and maybe I'll come back to that in a moment. So the experience of many, probably most, Jewish families, I can't put a figure on it, is that there's somebody in the past who was affected directly by the Holocaust. So if I just tell you a little story, or several as we go along in my own family, my father would say, as we were growing up, he would say, you know, I had two French uncles. And we would look at him, imagine I am a child aged 6, 7, 8, 9, something like that. And we'd say, what happened to them? And say, well, they were there at the beginning of the war and they weren't there at the end. And then me and my brother would say, well, what happened to them? And he said, well, they probably died in the camps. So this is, you know, there'll be other Jewish families, thousands, that would be able to relate to that in some way or another, that some people out there were there and then they weren't, and that you then generalized this into this expression, the camps, which of course has changed. That meaning of that word, that phrase, the camps, has changed very much over the years. I mean, at first, and we've just seen this unraveling with the anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, which was that because Richard Dimbleby, as it were, went in there with the BBC and opened up Bergen-Belsen, that this was what was understood to be the Holocaust. And it was also understood that Belsen itself was an extermination camp, which it wasn't. And so that kind of, as a child, I think insofar as I ever saw those images, that's what I understood to be the camps, the Holocaust. So that is an indication which was related in this general and particular with my father. And then another part of family history was that at my cousin's wedding, there was somebody there who my father pointed out was a cousin, and he was described as somebody who was put on a train in Western Poland to go into the east side of Poland to save his life. His parents put him on a train and he was only 17, and he was pointed out to me at this wedding, and that he never saw his parents again, that he was put into a Russian labor camp, fought in Anders Free Army, and arrived in Britain sometime in the late 40s, or no, sorry, 46, 47, somewhere about there. And that this was part of our family, Mishpucha in Yiddish, that this was part of the kind of general truth about the war. My father hadn't fought in the war. He was in the American army and wasn't called up till after the war. So you can see that as a Jewish family, you're beginning to hold these things in you. I was born in 1946. And then slightly exceptionally, but not entirely so, we had a trip. We had a trip to Germany, East Germany. My parents were communists at the time. They left the Communist Party in '57, perhaps on seeing East Germany. And we were there in Germany. We were in Weimar, and we used to regularly go on trips. And we went to the Goethe House and the Schiller House and the Friedrich the Great House and so on. And one day my mum and dad said to us, "You can't come with us on this trip because we're going somewhere that's so terrible and awful. We don't want you to see it." And I was 11, my brother was 15. And this was very strange. My parents never hid things from us. And they were, in fact, of course, going to Buchenwald. And I remember my mother coming back. I can remember her face. And my mother saying that she saw things there that she couldn't tell us about, that they were so horrific. And believe you me, I don't want to make this trivial, but I'm a child, so I'm 11 and I'm trying to understand what is the most horrific thing. And the only thing I could relate it to was my trips to the Tower of London and to the torture room in the Tower of London. I didn't know and understand extermination. This wasn't apparent as a Jewish child growing up. So you can see this is growing, that I'm beginning to sort of picture things. I've questioned myself reading the book and also always as to when it was I became aware of Nuremberg. Nuremberg seems to be a very problematic feature in this whole matter because British judges were involved. It was in a way an event of immense importance in the very first uncovering of what happened. I'm not saying it was complete in any way, but Nuremberg seems to have a strange, part-occluded role in our culture that I still don't understand. I saw a very good documentary theatre production based around the Nuremberg trials at the Tricycle Theatre. And I remember thinking, why isn't this better known? Why don't I know it? So I'm just leaving that hanging in the air, really. One of the breakthrough moments for me, not fully realizing the significance in my family, the fact that it was my father's two French uncles who were exterminated, were deported to Auschwitz. But a breakthrough moment for me was watching Marcel Offels's film Le Chagrin et la Pitié, which describes collaboration, which of course is a crucial part of the Holocaust. The Holocaust could only take place. No, sorry, I'll withdraw that. Part of the way the Holocaust took place was through collaborations in various parts of Europe. And watching Offels's film was quite shaking for me. I remember watching it with my father. And I remember that being a kind of breakthrough moment. As I remember it, there's a moment where Offel stands in the street and he looks up at a woman, this is purely from memory now, a woman who would have seen children being grabbed, as it happens, even illegally within the terms of the Vichy regime, would you believe? But anyway, looking up at the woman and her saying she didn't know anything at all about it. And I remember my father cursing to a certain extent under his breath at this moment of collaboration. So here we are, the BBC made a decision to put on a film that the French wouldn't show. Offels wasn't allowed to show that film in France. So part of the way in which we think about the British relationship with the Holocaust is also not simply the British relationship to the Nazis, but to other parts of Europe and what they did and what we did in relation to it. Yeah. So the French experience has got a direct personal relationship with me. It's also how did Britain relate to the French role in relation to the Holocaust, if you get me. Complicated, but it's actually quite important. And then coming to adulthood, sorry if I'm going on too long, a rather interesting moment, I went to work for the BBC and I worked in schools television. And I was working on a documentary about chemical warfare. And it was for schools, television. And I said to the producer, I was just a general trainee there, and I said to the producer, after we'd put up various examples of chemical warfare, I said, shouldn't we include the concentration camps? So I'm aged about 23, 24 now. And he said, oh, well, that wasn't a war. And I said, well, I've just read Lucy Davidovitz, and she did call it a war against the Jews. I know that a war against Jews. So I don't know whether necessarily that was controversial or not, but it was used to exterminate people. And isn't that a branch of war? No, he said, no, not at all. And so in this program about chemical warfare, the use of Zyklon B as a means to exterminate people was not actually included. though as it happens, various other forms in war, like mace being used in Vietnam, and of course napalm and so on was. And so you can see my growing awareness of and the difficulty as I'm growing up. And if I just zip through just one or two other things, another extraordinary moment watching television, as indeed this is one of our main ways. I mean, you could write a whole thesis on television, the Brits and the Holocaust, as to how television has played a role, was hearing the testimonies of Jan Karski, Rudolf, excuse me if I can't pronounce his name right, Verba, and Shmuel Ziegelboim, that watching those testimonies then raised the whole issue of what did Britain know during the war. And so there's that piece of history to fit into the jigsaw, what was known and what do we do about it. And seeing the testimonies of those three people and seeing accounts of it on British television, I think probably in the 90s, I would say, was a crucial moment. And if I can just finish here, at various points in the 21st century, I think, people have lifted the lid on what took place in the Channel Islands. And there's been the wonderful exhibition not long before shutdown, I think, before the pandemic hit us, here at the Wiener Holocaust Library on the Channel Islands. And I was suddenly remembered as I looked at the documents there that in fact my father had in fact spoken about this. Why? Because he was a friend of the family of Sam Russell, who wrote a little leaflet that was produced by the Daily Worker in the days that my father was a member of the British Communist Party, as was Sam Russell, later Lesser, a little document. And in fact, I then remembered my father had given this to me, and I still have it upstairs. I should have actually brought it down and shown you. I have it upstairs. This little booklet it is of what went on in Guernsey. And so I was then reminded of the fact that in that moment after the war, some people were digging about. Now, you might find all sorts of political reasons for it. As I say, it came from the Communist Party. I'm not going to hide that in any way. But it's not a bad piece of research in which Sam Russell found out that some of the Jews, not exactly sure exactly how many, were in fact arrested by policemen in what we would look at and see as bobbies. They're wearing kind of British police uniforms, and were in fact handed over and deported. And this in a way is slightly kind of burnt on my head, because I had one encounter that some people here will know about at the House of Commons a few years ago, where we were talking about Holocaust education here in Britain. I was invited to come and give a little talk, and I had written in my testimony beforehand that we should be a little careful about being triumphalist. That's all I said, just be a little careful about this, because obviously Britain was not invaded. So because Britain was not invaded, we should be very careful about saying what we would or wouldn't have done. And after all, there is this example of the Channel Islands, and also in the back of my mind that very reputable people behaved totally legally in making sure that some 75,000 Jews were deported from France. It was done very legally according to an agreement between Vichy France and the Nazi presence in Paris. And this enraged a particular MP who won't be mentioned, because let's not get personal here. This enraged this person, in a sense, sets the context for some of the things that particularly Hannah and Cara have said, which is that how dare I suggest that there could have been any kind of way in which, if the Nazis had invaded Britain, that somehow or other a Holocaust would have gone on here, that any kind of implication that might have happened clearly was totally enraging and totally out of order. And so in a way, it kind of casts a sense in which, how people have already alluded to this, that somehow or other we were better than that, which, of course, we didn't perpetrate that in that time, anything like it, but we don't know, there is a question mark as to how we would have behaved. And this is clearly a very, very controversial thing to say. At least it was for this particular MP. And in fact, I wasn't even allowed to carry on saying it. So I'll leave you with that hanging in the air. If people want to talk about children's books, I have made a little sort of inventory here, but I'll leave it. I think I've spoken too long already. Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I would just say I was made aware of some offensive comments in the chat. So I have changed the chat settings to host only. So if you make a comment, your question will still get sent to me. So apologies for that. I wanted to just thank the panelists, first of all. And I think before coming to some of the questions that have been sent to me, I wanted to start by coming back to the editors to ask a question about the timeliness of this book in the more global sense, because many of the panelists' contributions have touched on the wider ramifications of Holocaust memory and how that interacts, in this, some use the term multi-directional memory, interacts with Holocaust memory in Britain. And of course, one of the phenomena, the worrying phenomena that you alluded to, Andy, and I think Tom mentioned it too, is the re-emergence of the radical right, hate speech on social media, the resurgence of anti-Semitism. And I wondered if you might comment on that also in the context of perhaps thinking about the threat of the radical right and the debate around singularity, because in the German context, there's also a debate happening right now about this issue. And a lot of the sensitivities, I think, understandably, stem from a concern, which is, I think, legitimate, about criticisms of singularity risking playing into the hands of revisionists or icebreakers for fascism or so on. And it's something that sort of still has resonances from the Historikerstreit and not Ernst Nolte and so on. And I just wondered if Andy and Tom, you might say something about perhaps how the handbook deals with the history of the radical right and how it relates to Britain, and whether that played into your thoughts as you developed the book. So maybe starting with Andy.
Well, I think it's an important issue, Toby, that you're raising here, and I think you're highlighting the ongoing debates in Germany at the moment is also a good connection to make here. I think in terms of how the handbook fits within a broader trend within historiography, I think one of the issues that we are facing in terms of this particular country and this particular interrogation of our memory of the Holocaust is the extent to which, you know, there is this resistance to thinking in multi-directional ways, and also there's probably a lack of connectivity between thinking about how the development of Holocaust memory has emerged, has evolved, and has taken place in the same context as decolonization and the retreat from empire and a hangover for empire, an extent to which that's had ramifications bound up with issues around national identity, and of course the fragmentation of national identity in light of the movement, the trend towards devolution within the United Kingdom. So I think we have particular contexts here which haven't really been thought about enough and haven't been interrogated enough. And I think this has a pull-through relation in terms of the far right and fascism, of course, because there's arguably there's a long overdue need for us to have a serious grown-up conversation about national identities within the United Kingdom, within Britain, and a lot of that terrain, a lot of that territory has been, to borrow from Hannah's word previously, about co-opting that terrain by nefarious forces or by people who would want to frame that debate in a particular way. So I think you're highlighting an important issue, but I think there needs to be greater synergy here. There needs to be greater connections between these different fields. And I think when we're talking about Britain and the Holocaust, we need to be thinking in terms of the context of that, both historically and both in the post-war. And I think there needs to be a greater conversation between scholars who are working on Britain and the Holocaust and scholars who are working on post-war British history more generally. And also, in what you're highlighting here, is the need to think about this in the present and bring it right up to date, and not just to think of this as the far right from the 1970s, because the nature and the form of fascism in this country has itself evolved and developed. And I think there's Joe Mulhall's book recently, for instance, on the Holocaust and the far right in post-war Britain, I think is a good move in the direction of developing our knowledge there. I think Nigel Copsey's contribution to the handbook also works in that way. So there's much work to be done here, but I'll give way to Tom and his thoughts.
I mean, to be honest, Andy and Toby, I don't have much to add, but I'll follow in the sort of rich tradition of academics answering a different question to the one that was asked, and give you some sort of give you a sense of a kind of a different sort for kind of global context, and partly just because it was interesting. I read about it yesterday, and but in Hobart in Tasmania, and I think this highlights the kind of poverty of our own in Britain discussion about our past. In Hobart in Tasmania, there's a statue of William Crowther. William Crowther was the man who dismembered the body of William Lanny, the quote unquote last Indigenous Tasmanian man, and dispatched his skull to London. And Crowther's statue has now been augmented, and his hands are blood red, and he is now holding a machete. And this is a piece of kind of public art that is endorsed by Hobart local government and will be there for a year. And I think it's inconceivable that you could imagine a world in which something like that could stand in Britain, and could in a very kind of obvious and slightly crude manner identify the sort of the complexity of our own engagement with the past. And I think that in a sense the book is timely, because it is an effort to think about the full complexity of our engagement with the past and our public engagement with the past, at the point at which the real kind of poverty of the public conversation about that is really obvious.
Thank you. Would any of the panelists like to come in?
We just say yes. We haven't spoken. It might branch off from this, but maybe someone else might want to raise it. Is that, of course, one of the planks of Holocaust remembrance is the fact that people were trying to deny it, and the denial of the Holocaust has been a plank, to use the word again, of the far right. That was one of the means. So the whole issue around David Irving, though it isn't burning as it is now, it was at the time when David Irving was doing his mealy-mouthed stuff of, yes, this happened, but that didn't happen, and this was bad, and this wasn't so bad. And I was quite engaged with that. In fact, that was something that sort of redirected my attention to the Holocaust when it happened. And I helped produce a leaflet, Rabbi Hugo Grin was part of that, about Holocaust denial, because at the time that seemed to be where the right was going, the far right this is, that was trying to say that the Holocaust didn't happen. We righties are not actually that bad. We don't do that. But then at the same time, there was a kind of undertow, but actually, isn't it a shame we didn't, because the Jews are beastly. So you had a kind of very strange double edge that was going on. Deborah Lipstadt's drawn attention to that, of course. And then we had the trial as well, and so on. Now, some of that has receded, though. If you scurry around in the dark edges of the internet, of course, you find it alive and well. And as it happens, particularly amongst some of the people who appeared during the Trump era in the States. At the moment in Britain, that seems to be less likely. But at some point or another, people might want to observe that part of the moment of Holocaust remembrance in this country was, if you like, accelerated by the right's, the far right, I should say this, the far right's keenness to deny and to revise the nature of the Holocaust. And of course, the Wiener Holocaust Library is a fantastic example of it. I refer people to all the time, of saying, well, if you want to know what happened, look, there's a place over there, and that's where you can find out about it.
Thank you for the plug, Michael.
Yeah. Well, no,
we appreciate it. We do.
I always do. Yes.
So another question from the chat was about the relationship between World War I and Holocaust memory, and I think that is kind of an interesting perspective to think about, because in some ways memory culture in Britain is very closely linked to World War I, or was for a very long time, and perhaps is less now than it was, at least when I was growing up. So I wonder if there are any panelists who might be willing to say something about the way in which that remembrance culture may have sort of interacted with Holocaust memory. It's maybe a tricky one, or perhaps something about the Armenian genocide. I think is also something that the questioner was sort of getting at with that reference to the First World War. So maybe Donald might be a good person to say something about how the memory of the Armenian genocide relates to the Holocaust, World War I.
No, it's an interesting question, that, because you would, I mean, and the questioner is Peter Morgan. Thanks very much for the question. That's a really interesting one. I mean, in a sense, you given how much the Armenian genocide was in the British press and in the sort of British awareness around the time it was happening, you would expect it to be that the memory to have played more of a role than it actually did, I think, in terms of responding to the Holocaust. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I mean, maybe this knowledge is out of date actually, but at least one of the things I seem to remember when reading about British responses to the Holocaust and looking at some, primary sources on this, was the extent to which, in the first instance, some of the news coming from Nazi Germany is considered to be atrocity propaganda, of the kind that was that was being thrown around in the First World War, and there's a sort of skepticism about certain atrocity stories, rather than a preparedness to embrace it, which would be the consequence of the kind of embrace and discussion of what happened to the Armenians that you're thinking of there. But someone who has a bit more up-to-date knowledge in terms of the sources on British responses to the Holocaust and the build-up to the Holocaust in the 30s as well, be better placed to answer that then. Certainly, those concepts of sort of race extermination of a people, and it's really important you pick out that language, Peter, because basically what you're talking about there is the language of genocide avant la lettre, isn't it? All of these things are basically cognate terms of genocide, really. Extermination of a people, murder of the nation. In that sense, there within the culture, there's already, as a direct result of what happened to the Armenians, a kind of reservoir of thinking about what the very concept of genocide, even before the name of it. Mind you, that goes back a long time, as it happens. It's an interesting thing that people think about genocide as being a very modern concept, and wrongly warn us against its sort of ex post facto usage. But we do this all the time with concepts, don't we? And if one wants to follow down that route, there was an expression which was floating around from the early Middle Ages called strages gentium, which again, the destruction of people. The race is the Gens bit of as in Gens in genocide is there in that construction, the genitive plural. So those concepts have been around for a long time, in and out. But clearly, World War I was a big moment. But then it kind of there was somehow a lot of it went away, and it had to be kind of re-brought up in the Second World War period for reasons that I'm not exactly sure. I mean, it may be something to do with kind of wanting to put the war out of memory. That it certainly goes away in British culture. It goes away less in German culture, interestingly, because they don't have the same sort of cultural demobilization as I think John Horn once called it, because of the desire to refight the First World War as the Second World War. And in that context, actually, some of the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide are actually rather glorified by the German right, because they attacked a minority that was supposedly stabbing them in the back, and then fought their way, the heirs of these Turkish perpetrators of genocide, Ataturk, we're talking about here, kind of fought the way to, against the peace treaties that were imposed by the victorious allies on the Ottomans immediately after the First World War. They fought against that and managed to revise their treaties by 1922-23. So actually the Turkish kind of, sort of the genocidal element of the Turkish regime and their immediate nationalist successors are actually rather glorified in Germany in that period of kind of non-cultural demobilization. But in Britain, it may be the cultural demobilization causes an awful lot of forgetfulness about some of the main kind of tenets about civilization and so on around which the First World War was framed while it was happening.
Thank you, Donald. So we have a question from Daisy Goddard. So for those involved in or informed of the new Holocaust Public History Initiatives in London, what might these new developments tell us about the future of Holocaust representation in Britain? Actually, I think it might be quite good to hear from Cara and perhaps also Hannah on this one, because I think it does link into your contributions to the handbook. So I don't know, perhaps Cara or Hannah? Cara?
Yep. I assume by sort of the initiatives in London, we're talking about the memorial and the sort of education centre there. I think there was a hope when this was first sort of discussed and first sort of raised as a possibility that we'd have this new memorial and learning centre, that there might actually be the opportunity for sort of some critical sort of engagement and sort of a chance to sort of perhaps tackle some of the questions, like I said in my sort of very brief talk, about sort of these questions that we've had, that we've needed to answer, that we still haven't answered, about the tension, like Donald said, between education commemoration, talking about perpetrators. But I'm aware that then I think that there was that hope, and then I'm not entirely sure in terms of sort of furthering that future, sort of what necessarily is going to be achieved by this new centre. And I know that a colleague of mine, Emily Stiles, sort of has done work on this and sort of was involved in sort of working with the research with the Commission, and all of the findings that were seemed to be coming up were perhaps not really accepted, listened to. There was already an agenda there, and I know that sort of like Tom and other people were sort of more actively involved in that. So in terms of, I mean, my concern is that sort of the state we're in now, the British values, the universalisation, my concern is we're just going to be following along a very similar path. The hope is still there that perhaps we will be able to have a more critical engagement with Holocaust memory, Holocaust education, but I rather feel it will be a repetition of what we've already sort of experienced. But Hannah may have different thoughts on the matter.
No, I agree. There was the hope in 2014, 2015, that this would be quite an exciting development. I think currently it strikes me as one of those moments where a number of things come together in public commemoration, which make it really, really difficult to commemorate anything other than national glory. So when I want to tie this into what we talked about a moment ago about the memory of the First World War. When I arrived in Britain in 1995, I was struck by the memory of the First World War and the way in which it was enacted nationally. Coming from Germany, I never experienced anything like it, because you definitely do not remember the First World War very well, and definitely not publicly. If you do, it is a kind of far-right former soldiers groups affair. And so looking at this over the past 25 years, I find that Britain has constructed itself, its kind of central national symbols around the memory of two world wars in which Britain came off victorious, or relieved at least. And it's phenomenally difficult to turn this round into a more self-critical representation in the public. And in that sense, what is happening in Victoria Gardens and the entire disappointment that we might feel around the Holocaust Memorial, I think is an example of that. It's very difficult to turn it around and to say we are now needing to look critical at a British democratic tradition that didn't necessarily think about victims. We need to slot it into a history of empire, colonialism and genocide that is uncomfortable, but it's very difficult to turn the positive national self-image that is in those memorial days and memorial institutions around to something that is looking at national shame perhaps, or national failure, or a lack of exhibiting particular values. And I mean, I close with an observation that is in my mind from James Young, that when he was on the commission advising about the German Holocaust Memorial, that he said it's probably the discussion about it is more interesting than the actual thing that is being built. And perhaps that's what we are having here as well. The fact that we are also exercised by it, and that it has motivated many people to raise their voices to discuss the memorial and the monument that is planned for London, is perhaps that is perhaps the hopeful sign that we can do something else, that the debate will be ongoing and that people will come back and think about this in more critical ways.
Thank you, Hannah. That was a really thoughtful, interesting set of reflections. I think I'm going to wrap up the questions now, but I wondered, before I hand back to the editors for any last comments, did either Michael or Donald want to talk about that question of what happens in the future? Michael, how does the future of Holocaust memory in Britain look to you?
Yes, and very, very interesting question. Well, I work largely within education and children's books, and you can see patterns. You know, if you look at the pattern of the kinds of books and the kinds of stuff that goes on in schools, you know, things have changed. I was just reminding myself when Judith Kerr wrote When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. I mean, that's a book that is introduced to children very young. It's 1971. It's actually earlier than I thought. And it's been around for a long time. There've also been some rather odd books that still do very well, like Rose Blanche, which I find a highly problematic, because it seems to overlay a kind of a Christian story of sacrifice over what was, in this particular part of it, a Jewish tragedy. But it's welcomed within schools quite a lot, even though it has the same boy in the striped pajamas type kind of story about somebody trying to save the situation. So there's some problematic things going on, but I'm very active, very much involved in the work that goes on in Cambridge around Holocaust Memorial Day, around refugees, and around talking about the Holocaust in the context of what it is that human beings do when a structure in a society is of a particular kind, and it turns its attention to people and enacts genocide. So if you like, it's not purely from, as it were, the eye of the victim, but also from looking at how come governments can do this stuff. Yes, so I think that's an important way to look at things. And we've had on Holocaust Memorial Day itself testimonies from victims from Rwanda, as well as Holocaust victim survivor, in fact, Eva Clark, who was born in Majdanek, if I remember correctly, rather incredibly. And so that placing of the Holocaust in the context of genocides is, I think, very important. The questions that Hannah has referred to about whether the Holocaust can be put in the context of, as it were, potential or actual genocides by the British state in the past, I would both doubt that will happen, and also I know there's a debate about it. I would probably not think that it's advisable. I think that my own view is that there is sufficient uniqueness about the Holocaust for it to be considered, and then for it to be considered, this is within the education world, alongside genocides now. The whole issue of the British Empire, and indeed the related genocides taking place in North America and so on, and obviously continuing in Australia, all that stuff, that seems to me so massive and so important, and that relating it in some way or another to the Holocaust seems to me highly problematic for a whole variety of reasons that I can't go into now. That's not to deny that it shouldn't be done. I've spent many years involved in that as well, but it just seems to me hooking the two has got a lot of problems.
That's fascinating to listen to. Thank you, Michael. So I think I will come back to the editors now just for some final reflections. And I just wondered if you could engage with that question also about the future of Holocaust remembrance. And I just wonder, quite a lot of the discussion this evening has focused around memory culture, relationship to other genocides. And I just wonder if you feel it's a concern that the discussion perhaps also needs to consider the question of the centrality of the Holocaust as an event. And Michael was just talking about the Holocaust in a way has such weight and specificity that one would like to think that it can be considered helpfully in this sort of broader perspective alongside other genocides. It seems like a lot of the discussion has been about how that's not necessarily always working well, and then things have become more divisive. But I just wonder about how much you feel that by, for example, the way that you framed this, the book, whether there's I think I've sort of lost my thread a little bit, but I'm just sort of thinking about the centrality of the discussion of the Holocaust versus other issues like memory politics and other genocides. And so I just wonder to what extent that's something that you thought about when you were putting this book together.
Thanks, Toby. I'll answer first and then hand over to Andy. I mean, and again, I'll probably not answer your question, but I think that, you know, I don't think there's a deep-seated problem in terms of our ability in Britain to talk about the Holocaust in relation to other genocides, and it's, you know, pretty broadly well symbolized by the fact that you know, we have an organization in the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust that, you know, effectively denies the Armenian genocide by only calling it labeling it a set of atrocities. Now, that seems to me to be a deeply worrying position to start from in terms of kind of Holocaust memorialization in Britain, and one that you know, I remain kind of you know, aghast at every year, and you know, especially when we talk about things like denial as being, you know, an act of violence in and of itself. So you know, I think that unless or until we, you know, are brave enough to use that language around other incidences of mass violence, then it's going to be very problematic. I think in terms of the future, you know, it's interesting. Cara and Hannah talked about kind of moments of hope. I guess my sense is that those moments of hope have gone in some ways, and you know, I think that if and when the memorial is built next to Parliament, it you know, I think that's just the very symbolism of that act will make it very problematic. I mean, you know, what would it what message would it send if you know, there wasn't built next to the Reichstag was not the murdered, you know, memorial to the murdered Jews, but a memorial to the victims of the slave trade in Britain? It would appear to be a very odd development, and I think that this is equally odd. But I don't wish to, you know, end on the kind of note of despair in that sense. I think that, going back to Peter's question in the earlier about, you know, the kind of language around the First World War and the notion of exterminations of peoples, and that being a kind of public language, I think that ultimately, in a scholarly sense, is what I would like to see in terms of the kind of engagement with this question of British responses to the Holocaust and British responses to genocide more generally, is to place it in that context, in a context in which the notion of the extermination of peoples was a, you know, publicly talked about, and was an element of public discussion, and to situate it in that sense, I think would be a kind of more fruitful future, it seems to me. But I will stop there and hand over to Andy.
So just, I don't want to speak for long, but just to clarify, I think what I was trying to say before, not very well at all, was that I just wonder whether you thought about the opportunities that might be missed through, I don't know, let's say failures in our ability to talk in a constructive way about the Holocaust, or to remember the Holocaust, or learn about the Holocaust effectively, that could also include the specificities of the Holocaust, like the opportunity to learn about anti-Semitism, the opportunity to learn about, you know, what how it was possible that Nazi Germany undertook to murder 6 million Jews, and the relationship between anti-Semitism and that. I just wonder whether that opportunity is at risk through the way that memory politics is developing in the UK. Andy.
Okay. Well, I think in terms of the memory culture issue, I think one thing which does bear mention is the fact that I think we're starting to see a kind of increasing localization or a regionalization of memory in Britain, or there's indications to suggest that might happen in terms of things that are happening in the various different constituent nations of the United Kingdom. There's growing interest, for example, in the history or connections with the Holocaust in Scotland or Wales or Ireland or so on and so forth. So I think there's kind of a grassroots, or there's signs of a grassroots movement to sort of move away from this notion of a uniform collective British Holocaust memory. And I think that's probably a reflection as well of the increasing fragmentation of British national identity, or at least increasingly being called into question by various forces. I think one of the issues with the memory culture also is the extent to which if we can speak at a level of official memory, is the tendency to advocate or promote the idea of the Holocaust as the paradigm of genocide, and I think that's not helpful in the sense of detaching it from the broader phenomena of genocide, from the broader phenomena of mass atrocity and state violence, and actually the capacity for states to engage in state violence for a variety of reasons, whether that's ideological or driven by resources or the desire to secure resources. I mean, these are potentialities which transcend the 1940s, and I think they're very real issues that we need to open our eyes to at that kind of official level. I think just a couple of other things in terms of the extent to which we're prepared to do that. I think we can only begin to do that by actually revisiting one of the questions which, as Donald highlights, has remained unaddressed and not engaged with for a generation now, which is, why are we doing this? What's the rationale? And to some extent, every generation we should be revisiting that question of why are we doing this. I'm not saying there is a fixed answer that's going to exist for time memorial on that, but nevertheless, we don't really seem to want to engage with that question of why are we teaching, learning, remembering the Holocaust. And I wonder if one of the reasons we don't want to engage in that is because of the lack of nice, neat answers to it, and also our reticence to try and actually uncouple and take apart memory and education, remembrance and education. We seem like we want to collapse those two things into each other to make it easier on ourselves. And I think in terms of looking forwards, yeah, we're not going to move in a positive direction until we're prepared to confront those realities of what the Holocaust was, and to connect it back to its historical context and its phenomenological context in terms of what this thing was and what it actually reveals about the human condition. But I'll stop rambling on that note.
Okay, we're going to have a couple of last comments from Donald, and then I think we're going to wrap up.
Well, thanks very much, Toby, for that. Yeah, I actually just wanted to, I've mentioned that I was looking forward to seeing what the Imperial War Museum came up with, and thinking about kind of positive elements as well as, I mean, I do share, to be honest, I do share the general view that's, Hannah and Cara and Andy and Tom have expressed, but also, I mean, I'm looking forward very much to seeing what the Imperial War Museum does with the exhibition. And I also want to give another plug, like Michael, for your institution, the Wiener Library. I mean, it seems to me that guys have been very, I remember seeing an exhibition on photographs on the Armenian genocide several years ago there, and you guys have been kind of doing, obviously you've got your main brief, but you've also been making connections too, and that's been I for one have appreciated that,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really nice point to say that memory is not centralized. Memory exists among multiple people, institutions, cultures, and Britain is not monolithic in that sense. Michael. Oh, sorry, I think you might need to unmute, Michael.
Tiny postscript, I'm involved in the IWM exhibition. There's going to be an aural installation and some of them are linked to different parts of the country. So part of that regional aspect that Andy's already referred to. So there's going to be some rather interesting things that are going on, and I'm involved partly in that. So I think, yes, you'll see some quite interesting links going on there. And I would just say is that, you know, as we unravel this stuff and go on and on unraveling it, the thing that I'm constantly amazed and shocked by is that people, you know, kill each other in all sorts of circumstances, and we've got this horrible institution called war where people kill each other, and what we're talking about is exactly as I think referred to as state violence. So this is, we're looking at a moment in history that isn't unique to itself for that, of state violence, of the state using its power that it derived originally legitimately. This is the horrifying thing, as we can all talk about the elections of the early 1930s in Germany. It was legitimate. The power was legitimate. That's what's so horrific. And this state power, and the fact that, you know, we live in countries that have state power, and this is part of the vital part, I think, in the engagement with the Holocaust for itself, as opposed to necessarily linking it to other things, but for itself, because we're seeing the inaction of a state doing this stuff, of taking war against civilians. So this is not gun against gun, this is gun against body, against a body that is unarmed. And so that, I think, we quite often refer to and go back to in some of the work that is going on. And I think whatever this memorial stuff is and will happen, that's what I'd be interested in seeing emerge, is this aspect of state power. Now, if it's a state institution that is putting in place this Holocaust memorial, we might imagine some kind of caution, some sidestepping around that. As I say, you know, we know about the democratic origins of the Nazi state. That's what's so horrifying. I better stop. Thank you.
Well, I suppose memory belongs to all of us, and this evening has been a great example of that we've all been able to come together and share our thoughts on how Holocaust memory works in Britain. And it's been a real pleasure. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Hannah Holtschneider, Cara Critchell, Donald Bloxham, Michael Rosen, and especially I'd like to thank Andy Pearce and Tom Lawson for editing and bringing together this volume and for offering such insightful reflections this evening. Thank you very much. And also thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Please come to visit the library soon. We very much look forward to welcoming you back. Take care, everyone. Have a good evening.